Good afternoon and welcome to our sixth session of this conference, which is being chaired by Professor Siddiq Wahid, who is currently teaching the history of Central Eurasia at Shiv Nadar University. Professor Wahid did his PhD at Harvard University on Islam and Buddhism in Central Asia. Among the posts he has held are Vice Chancellor, Islamic University of Science and Technology, Chair of the Professor of History at the University of Jammu, and a Senior Fellow of the Center for Policy Research. His current work involves the interface between Central Eurasia and South Asia. Professor Wahid, the floor is yours.
Oh, sorry. My apologies. Yeah, I'm Siddiq Wahid. I just, in consideration of time, I'm not going to reintroduce everybody because you've got it in your folders and the handouts that have been handed out. But I thought I would briefly mention something which may or may not be in your folder because I think it's a standout. The order of speakers, I seem to have. Oh, is it?
In the seating order.
Okay, all right. I'll ask Professor Sengupta if she would like to speak. Thank you.
A very good afternoon, and thank you very much for the invitation. I will be talking about the Indian trade communities in Central Asia. You have to excuse my voice. Delhi's pollution has not been kind to me. Shikarpur is a town in Sindh. Its geographical location at the mouth of the Bolan Pass led to its development as an important commercial and financial center. From Shikarpur, one could approach the Central Asian Uzbek Khanates through various routes. One could go through Multan, Peshawar, Kabul, and then on to Bukhara, or through Quetta, Kandahar, Mazar-e-Sharif. Travel accounts record the presence of Shikarpuri merchants in Bukhara from about the 16th century. Now, I first encountered the traders in the course of my examination of Bukharan state structures in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in travel accounts written either by Western travelers or their Indian, Persian-speaking munshis. Most of these accounts, like that of Izzatullah in 1813, Alexander Burns between 31 and 32, and Mohan Lal, of course, who accompanied him, and Vambury a little later in 64, record the presence of Indian traders and moneylenders in the bazaars of Bukhara. Now, this in itself is, of course, not surprising since trade connections between the two regions along what is known romantically as the Silk Road is very well recorded. What was surprising to me was their absence in ethnographic records of the time and the fact that even very detailed studies of Bukhara did not mention the presence of an Indian settlement. And it was actually this absence which led me to look into what I found to be a rather interesting diasporic group. Now, the contemporary ubiquity of the diaspora as a focus of study is informed by dispersal of people on the one hand and new forms of connectedness on the other. The growth of interest in matters of global scope has led to rethinking about spatial and temporal categories where not only the nation and its borders have been subject to scrutiny, but also categories like regions and areas have come into interrogation. Amidst this rethinking of spatial and temporal categories, diasporas have gained currency as a productive framework for reimagining locations, movements, identities, and social formations. There are therefore multiple ways in which trajectories and identities are being charted, bringing into questions terms like what is known as the Indian diaspora, which brings with it the temptation to look upon them as stable bounded communities or transcendent homogeneous groups, which of course they were not. All of these issues of reifying, abstracting, and generalizing come into play when one examines what is identified as the Indian diasporic community in Central Asia. Close attention to the generic terms used here would indicate that traditionally groups and networks that were termed as diasporic were not at all Indian in the contemporary sense. They were subsumed within general categories like Multani, Khatri, or later Shikarpuri, but were a conglomerate of different groups. Also, movements extended beyond what is delimited as the frontiers of the 5 Soviet Central Asian states, creating opportunities for new imaginations that are rooted in networks that operated across regions. Mainstream economic history, of course, identifies the supremacy of maritime trading routes and European trading companies that dominate these routes as a very significant factor for the decline of commercial relations between India and the regions to its west and north. But recent books, of course, have critiqued these views and have said that the caravan trade not only survived but also expanded because of the growing demand for Indian and Chinese goods, which resulted because of the growth in maritime trade and resulted in circulation of money and liquidity, which actually supported the subcontinental overland trade also. Pointing to the absence of presence of Indian merchants in Iran, Central Asia, and Russia, Stephen Dale, for example, located the activities and economic significance of Indian communities that traded in these regions in the 17th and 18th centuries. He notes that when Anthony Jenkinson finally fought his way into Bukhara in December 1557, he reported that Indian merchants were selling textiles. And of course, 40 years later, the next logical step was taken by moving production to the market. Darya Khan Multani used his capital to bring in Indian merchants to Samarkand, where the manufactured cloth used locally produced yarns and wools. Now, Indian connections with these regions to the north and the west, of course, go back to antiquity, and that there had traditionally been exchange of populations at various levels as traders, scholars, and religious preachers. In fact, as Aurup Banerjee notes, the Indian presence had pre-Mughal traces. From about the 15th century, if not earlier, Indian settlements were significant in Iran and Turan, including Bukhara, Samarkand, Tashkent, and probably other urban centers of the Khanate of Bukhara, and even in Russia. Documents relating to the property of Naqshbandi Pirs include numerous references to places and structures named after Hindwan, including rest houses, canals, neighborhoods, villages. This suggests the presence of settlements in the vicinity of Samarkand and Shahr-e-Shabs in the 14th century. Records show that during the relatively stable era of the Mughal Empire in India and the Safavid rule in Iran, Indian bankers and merchants traveled to and resided semi-permanently in Mawarun-Nahar, but also Afghanistan and Iran. From Iran, they would move on to the Russian territory at Astrakhan and traverse right up the Volga to Moscow, where they resided in what was known as Kitai-Gorod, or the Chinese city, where most foreign merchants lived. Punjabi Khatris, Pashtuns, Afghans, Marwaris from Rajasthan were the principal merchant groups from the Mughal territories of South Asia who traded in these regions. Now, traditionally, the study of the diaspora group revolved around the dilemma of groups who, though settled in host state, maintain memories of homeland and lead a dual existence between two cultures. Discussions are essential in extension of ethnographic studies, where memory is seen to play a very significant role. Now, the introduction of traders and merchant communities as part of the study of diaspora added a new dimension and extended it to examine the impact that this linkage paid in the category of analysis. The study of what is known as the trade diaspora emerged in the 1970s when a distinction was made between merchants who moved and settled and traders who continued to move back and forth. The latter might have begun with a single settlement abroad, gradually tended to get a whole series of settlements in alien towns. The result was an interrelated set of commercial communities forming a trade network or a trade diaspora. In most cases, they lived as compact groups within the host states and maintained their own lifestyle. One such very interesting example of a trader community is the Indian Shikarpuri trade and money lending communities in Central Asia. Till the end of the 19th century, this community utilized its power as agents of Indian firms to finance trans-regional trade and a complex system of rural credit. Shikarpuris were involved in both finance and trade and exemplified the tie-up that existed between local capital markets in India and the markets for financial services and goods outside the subcontinent. The study of the Indian diaspora in Central Asia is also interesting, since they cannot actually be defined in terms of characteristics that are attributed to these groups. In fact, one keeps classical definitions of the diaspora. In a lot of ways, it is difficult to define them as a diasporic community principally because they were never permanent settlers, in most cases returning to India after having lived in Bukhara for a maximum of 10 to 12 years. In fact, there was a steady stream of traders who went and then returned, maybe as early as within a year. The Indian traders who resided there rarely came with their families or for any length of time. In one of the first descriptions of these traders, Mir Izzatullah, who visited Bukhara in 1813, wrote, "Hindus of Shikarpur are to be found in considerable numbers in Bukhara. They go there for trade, live for a year or two and return, never settling permanently." Similarly, the British census reports of the 19th century of the Bombay Presidency identified that many Hindus are employed as agents of the Bukharan trade. The temporary nature of the residence is also evident from the fact that ethnographic writings that trade the demography of Bukhara from the end of the 19th to the early 20th centuries do not record the presence of any Indian households in the many numerous quarters into which the city was divided. Neither do the documents that relate to the delimitation that happened later. However, this omission may be explained by the fact that by that time, delimitation was about 1920s, 1924 actually. A large part of the Indians had already left the region. Another could be that the successors of some of the Indians who settled permanently lost contact with their own language and generally recorded Russian as their mother tongue. In a census that was based on dialect as the defining characteristics, they were included within the larger Russian population. The absence of any recorded households in the 19th century, which, Sukharyeva has this very detailed book on the quarters of Bukhara, and she notes that in Bukhara, Indian traders lived principally in two caravansarais, Sarai Karshi and Sarai Hindi, and that in Sarai Karshi there were about 60 rooms, each inhabited by 2 or 3 people, and at Sarai Hindi there were about 10. Given the volume of trade between the two regions, which Markowitz talks about and which peaked during the 1870s, this absence of a single settlement of Indian traders from ethnographic records presents a dilemma to which I will return when I conclude my presentation. Now, Shikarpur was the center of a financial network that developed in the second half of the 18th century in direct relation to the rise of the Durrani Empire. Although it suffered from the decline of the state in the first 2 decades of the 19th century, the expertise and capital that was accumulated by the bankers allowed them to take advantage of a new surge in Indo-Central Asian trade from 1840s to build an active network based on financing of caravan trades and on close links with the Uzbek Khanates of Central Asia. Merchants were heirs to a long tradition of commercial contacts. The British annexation of Sindh did not modify the outward orientation of the Shikarpuri bankers, and the traders who travelled were greatly benefited from the fact that Hindu traders were present in all the major trading points. Mohanlal, for instance, talks about how he met them in every city that he passed as he moved on to Bukhara. In Kabul, Mohanlal says that the Hindus are nearly 2,000 in numbers, have large families, and he talks about a Hindu banker in Peshawar. He also talks about similar Hindu traders and bankers. While Shikarpur was involved in both finance and trade by the latter half of the 19th century with a decline in the caravan trade, they principally became involved in financing rural agriculture. The substantial estates left by them tend to suggest that the profitability of money lending business was fairly high. All contemporary travelers agree that they were that Shikarpur was more known as a financial center than a trading center, and in fact travelers attest to the fact that in 19th century Shikarpuris had a monopoly over hundis in Bukhara. The Shikarpuri hundi in fact used to circulate all the way from Kolkata to Nizhny Novgorod, which means that traders did not actually have to carry money with them. Their hundis were actually supported in all of these places right up to Russia. The Shikarpuri network actually operated on a very specific system of partnership which was known as the Shah Gumasta system. This allowed a small group of men located in Shikarpur to control and finance commercial transactions over a vast area extending to Khorasan and Turkestan. Each of these men had a number of agents spread over localities, and the system was developed to deal with the fact that it was difficult to travel to Central Asia. The existence of a sophisticated hundi system made it possible to avoid transporting currencies in large quantities along dangerous routes. It also limited the necessity of bankers themselves actually having to travel frequently. Now, most descriptions that we have of the Shikarpuris, of course, are of Hindu traders who led a life which was very distinct from that of the local inhabitants. The Indian Muslims who went there tended to assimilate with the local population, so it was difficult to distinguish them in most cases. Indian migrants lived together in caravansarais, like I said, they paid taxes, but of course there are differences in the way their lives are defined, with some saying that, they tended to live together because the locals were not very supportive of them because they tended to lend money at very high interests. There were reports that they were not allowed to have their own festivals, but similarly, there are others who say that there were quaint figures drawn inside these caravansaries, and of course, while they were prohibited from constructing temples and other religious buildings, often rituals were conducted, and these and remnants of these have survived. Of course, one has to keep in mind that these were only evident in the Governor Generalate of Turkestan, not in the Emirate of Bukhara. Similarly, Mohanlal notes that Hindus were allowed to smoke. There are very few photographic evidences. So this is a photograph of Indian musicians and of Indians smoking inside caravansaries, a privilege that the local inhabitants actually did not enjoy. They were also occasionally allowed to cremate their dead. Now, with the Russian takeover of the region, a part of the trade, of course, passed to the hands of the Russian merchants. However, the adaptability of these Russian traders in this period ensured their survival. When they found their operations curbed in larger cities, they shifted their base to rural money lending, in which small amounts were involved, and the tediousness of keeping records kept the Russians away. In the meantime, the British, firmly entrenched in India, were concerned about the Russian advance into the Central Asian region, and a rivalry which is known as the Great Game began to be played out. As British dependents, it affected the pattern of Indian trade in the regions. They were looked with suspicion as being British agents, something that travelers also testify to. For example, Mohanlal notes that a crowd of Hindus came up to him who would inquire about him, the purpose of making such a long journey, and in fact, his purpose was to gather information for Alexander Burns. And not without reason, because there were elaborate intelligence network in the region. And, he talks about people who actually befriended the locals so that they could get more information. Administrative measures introduced in the region by the turn of the century also resulted in an exodus. An important section consisted of moneylenders. Since money lending was a taboo, most moneylenders were Hindus, and they advanced small sums of money to poor peasants and craftsmen, and occasionally financed well-to-do merchants. In fact, the Emir of Bukhara himself was occasionally financed by them. As a rule, loans were advanced under mortgage, and Burns, for instance, writes that there was no market or no village without a moneylender. Most investigations pointed out that within a few years, the Indian moneylenders were able to acquire large sums of money, and this led to Russian administrators taking measures against them, most particularly in the Governor Generalate, though not so much in the Emirate of Bukhara. These measures to curb their activities led to a general exodus, and by the turn of the centuries, the numbers were considerably reduced. In 1881, the Central Asian Commercial Bank was founded, which further reduced the activities of the Indian moneylenders in Bukhara. This exodus, or even the change of moneylenders to traders, was slow, and many continued to operate till the 1920s. The Russian Revolution and the fall of the Khanate of Bukhara and the declaration of the Bukharan Soviet Socialist Republic meant that by 1920s, most of them had left the region. The absence of large settlements of Indians in the region in the 19th century, given the volume of their recorded trade, remains largely unexplained. A possible explanation could be that this absence was because the Central Asian region was not part of the British Empire, and most Indian settlements were to be found in places where the British actually had their colonies. In fact, at the time when Shikarpuris were extending their trade practices, the region was being taken over by the Russians. Another could be about the fact that Shikarpuri women never traveled beyond the Oxus, so the Indian community consisted of men. As to why they never traveled, one really has no explanation, though it could be, the hardest nature of the journey, or a reversal on the taboo of travel on men. On the other hand, the opportunity of marriage for these men in the region was severely limited. The lives of these, as recorded by travelers, however, provides very interesting insights into the nature of contemporary Bukharan society. Most writings focus on 19th century Bukhara as the era of the infamous Amir Nasrullah and his son Muzaffaruddin. The image of intolerance and fanaticism that is portrayed is reflected in this verse by Arminius Vambari while he was traveling to Bukhara, and he writes, "To Bukhara thou goest, art thou mad? Not by chains and bondage there to be had." That most travelers were aware of the perils is evident from the concluding lines by Mohanlal on the city of Bukhara. When he makes these few comments, he said, "We had been respectably received and civilly treated. Yet, what did we expect? And on reflection, on the 1,000 perils that had been represented to me, even by my friends, as accompanying our footsteps and the few that really occurred, I conceive that we have been most fortunate." The portrayal of fanaticism that represents itself in most narratives of the region and of which Mohanlal really did not find evidence requires re-examination. One way of doing it could be to study the lives of these trader communities who lived in Bukhara. The emergent image could well be somewhat different from those recorded in most narratives of the region. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And within the time, without even a 2-minute warning, so that's very grateful. I was just going to say that as a moderator, I'm a minimalist, except when it comes to time, and then the questions at the end, where I'll have to assert myself, but otherwise, very minimal interaction. I'm delighted to ask Dr. Janet Rizvi to speak now. Delighted because her work is about Ladakh, and whenever I want to, as a Ladakhi, whenever I want to learn something about the history of Ladakh, I refer to her immediately. And so delighted to have. I should make mention of her last sort of book that she has done, which is Pashmina, the Kashmir Shawl and Beyond, which is, and previous to that, she'd done something about the trade and that area, which is the subject of today. So I thought it might be of interest. I think that book was in collaboration with Monisha Ahmed. So, Dr. Rizvi.
Thank you. Siddiq, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. In another century from now, when I was drafting my the introductory volume that I wrote about Ladakh way back in the 70s, and hit on the title Ladakh, Crossroads of High Asia, I think my focus was so limited that I didn't realize that that Ladakh was only one of many crossroads. Surely it was historically, culturally, and commercially a crossroads. But there were crossroads all over Asia, and I think it's worth noting that the Great Himalaya and its associated ranges, which seem like a barrier, were never a barrier because the mountains dip and make passes, and there were many passes. And there was trade running through them, largely in subsistence goods between the south, where food grains were grown, and the north to the Tibetan Plateau, which produced salt and wool. They were bartered, often at seasonal fairs, and Ladakh itself had two routes through the ranges with Plains India. One was via Srinagar, which had 3 passes, and one was via Manali, which had 4 passes. Gosh. There's the Zojila in the early 20th century. I'm sorry if they're not in very good order. And north of Leh, there was a fiendishly difficult route with 5 passes, taking you through the Karakoram and ranges north of the Karakoram to Yarkand in Central Asia. But the difficulty of the route did nothing to deter the traders. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, the most lucrative commodity of the Trans-Yarkand trade was charas. And much of the charas trade was in the hands of traders from Hoshiarpur, some of whom set up branches of their businesses in Yarkand, and others opened shop in Leh. Similarly, a few Kashmiri mercantile families did business with Leh and Yarkand, some settling in Leh as others did, as others did, some of them from Yarkand. The marriages of these settlers with local women gave rise to the Muslim community of Leh, known as Arghons. And I'm delighted to identify my chair today as part of that community, as a descendant of traders from Kashmir who married locally and who had branches of their family in Yarkand and in Lhasa. And he is very much an Arghon. And Leh was pretty much a staging post for the trade. None of the commodities, most of the commodities just passed through. None were produced in Ladakh, and very few were consumed in Ladakh. The main business of the Kashmiri traders in Leh in the 18th, 19th centuries was Pasham. Pasham, the raw material of the Kashmir shawl, the under fleece of the Changra goat. The finest Pasham was produced not in Leh itself, in Ladakh itself, but on the lush pastures of western Tibet. A treaty of 1684 gave a monopoly of the Pasham trade between Ladakh and Srinagar to a caucus of Kashmiri merchants. And this monopoly lasted, I'm not quite sure till when, but perhaps the middle of the 19th century, when peasant traders from Ladakh, who had already been trading in subsistence communities with the herdspeople who produced the Pasham, or whose goats produced the Pasham, they'd been trading in subsistence communities. They broke into the Pasham trade to a lesser extent, but they had to travel further because the Kashmiris had the monopoly of the nearer pastures, of the produce of the nearer pastures. And to the best of my knowledge, these traders, peasant traders from down the Indus from Leh, they were known as Shamma because that's the name of the district. They're the only village traders along the whole line of the Himalaya who integrated a luxury product into their trading operation. And well, I'm not going to, I've captioned the pictures, so I won't take time to explain them, I don't think. It will be necessary. Oh dear, I'm sorry. I'm not very good at this. There's the Pasham being actually produced. And here, this is a collage of shawls, the kind of shawls that were being, that were made from that unpromising looking fleece. For Kashmir, the Pasham trade was only the start of the long and intricate process of crafting the shawls for which it was famous, for which Kashmir was famous. And the finished shawls were again the subject of a complex international trading operation. It's only in the last quarter of the 18th century that the trade starts showing up in English or other European language sources, which is all that I can access. In the first, when a few intrepid French and English travelers reached the valley. In the first quarter of the 19th century, The trade was controlled by mainly Iranian or Central Asian merchants. Both George Forster in 1783 and William Moorcroft 40 years later noticed the presence in Srinagar of shawl merchants from Central Asia, Afghanistan, Iran, and Turkey, as well as from India of the plains. And Forster got much of his information from, quote, a Georgian merchant who had long resided in the country. Much of Asian commerce in the pre-modern period was carried on by family firms, and two brothers from Shiraz in Iran, Haji Muhammad Javed and Haji Muhammad Hussain, one residing in Kashmir and the other in Baghdad, doing business in shawls, perhaps represented a typical setup. In 1831, according to Victor Jacquemont, most of the shawls manufactured in Kashmir are purchased by a very small number of rich and respectable merchants, mostly Hajis. Quote, end quote. 4 years later, Godfrey Vine put the number that had been resident in Srinagar at between 200 and 300, but between Jacquemont's visit and Vine's, there were Sunni Shia riots and the Iranians decamped. Oops. I think I made some changes to the slides and perhaps didn't save them. That's why they're not in quite good order. The trade between Kashmir and Bukhara, which was the main entrepot for exporting shawls to Russia, was mainly in the hands of merchants from Kabul. The principal entrepôts for the shawls to West Asia and beyond were Lahore and Surat in the 18th and early 19th centuries, and Bombay thereafter. Much of the trade was in the hands of the Banyas of Surat, later partly supplanted by the Marwaris. The bales of shawls went from Srinagar via Muzaffarabad to Peshawar, where in the 1780s they were the object of a brisk middleman's trade, and on through the Khyber Pass to Kabul. Srinagar to Peshawar was about 20 days' march, and Peshawar to Kabul another 9. From Kabul, the shawls went either via Bukhara into Russia, or via Herat or Kandahar into Iran, and on to the Ottoman Empire by either Baghdad or Erzurum. I've been able to describe the trades of Ladakh and Kashmir, especially as regards shawls and pasham, because these have been the objects of my research over many years. But I believe that they, and perhaps Anita's tale of the Shikarpuri settlers, or of the Shikarpuri trading mercantile operation in Central Asia, may be taken as exemplars of how the long-distance commerce of pre-modern Asia was organized and the extent to which it involved the movement of people and their necessary interaction. Surely Pashman shawls constituted only a fraction of the commodities being traded all over the continent. I've already mentioned how, for communities settled in adjacent but different ecological zones, like Ladakh's Sham traders and the Sherpa and Takali of Nepal on the one hand, and the herdspeople of western and southern Tibet on the other, for them, the exchange of subsistence commodities, food grains on the one hand, wool and salt on the other, was a necessary survival strategy. But the long-distance trades, of which traffic in luxury goods over the Karakoram between the Punjab and Xinjiang via Leh was one, and the trade in shawls out of Srinagar was another, were a different matter altogether. the horse and camel caravans, plodding their weary way over mountain and desert to the inland entrepôts of Bukhara, Mashhad, Isfahan, Baghdad, and Aleppo, and finally to Istanbul, or north to Astrakhan, Orenburg, and Nizhny Novgorod, as well as the ships, their holds bulging as they set their sails before the trade winds, which drove them from Surat and other ports to Bushehr and Hormuz, Basra, and Jeddah. The ships and the caravans and the ships carried a whole range of luxury goods, shawls, of course, and other fine textiles like silk from China and Iran, Benares brocades, muslins from Bengal, and printed cottons from Gujarat and South India. Also carpets, tea, spices, sugar, tobacco, indigo, and latterly synthetic dyes, dyestuffs, precious metals, narcotics, and more. Horses in great numbers were led through the passes from Central Asia into India till nearly the end of the 19th century. Even taking the costs of transport into consideration, a commodity that was available and relatively cheap in one region could fetch a huge profit many hundreds of miles away. Until the late 19th century, Inner Asia had few roads fit for wheeled vehicles, so goods on the long-haul routes were carried by horse or camel caravan. I think I showed you a couple of caravans earlier. The actual transporters, pony and camel drivers, usually traversed only those parts of the routes that lay within easy enough reach of their home bases. In both the mountains of Afghanistan and the deserts of Syria, there were tribes that specialized in the transport of trade goods. Ladakhi villagers, who in the agricultural off-season doubled up as transporters between Leh and Srinagar, or Leh and points on the route to Yarkand, were known as Kiraya Kash. The big mercantile firms typically sent a partner or a trusted agent to travel the entire route, negotiating with transporters and supervising the transshipment of goods from one form of transport to the next, their disposal at the final destination, and the purchase of commodities to fill a return caravan. Or, if their business were focused on a particular region, a partner or agent would settle for years or even permanently, as again we've been hearing from Anita, at the destination market, as we have seen with the Iranian shawl merchants in Srinagar. Thus, every trading hub, whether Leh, Srinagar, Bukhara, Baghdad, even supposedly isolated Lhasa, had a community of foreign merchants, adding a multicultural, if I dare use the word cosmopolitan, layer to local society. By one estimate, the number of Indian merchants settled in Iran and Central Asia may have reached a total of 35,000 by the turn of the 18th, 19th centuries. And in 1832, Alexander Burns noted that much of Central Asia's trade was in the hands of Hindu merchants who, quote, had houses of agency from Astrakhan and Mashhad to Kolkata. As well as trade in commodities, this mercantile network operated a continent-wide system of financial services. The lingua franca was Persian. And here I can't resist quoting a passage from Francis Younghusband's The Heart of a Continent, recounting his overland journey from Peking to Srinagar in 1887. Arriving at Aksu in Xinjiang, he found it home to a community of Indian and Pathan merchants, and he stayed overnight in the sarai. Quote, "It's in these sarais that one meets the typical traveling merchant of Central Asia. They're always interesting to talk to, intelligent, shrewd, full of information. They're very cosmopolitan and do not really belong to any country except that in which they are at the time living. And this habit of rubbing up against men of so many different countries gives them a quiet, even temperament and breadth of idea, which makes them very charming company." End of quote. Among the privileged foreign merchants in Lhasa, there was a community of Ladakhis and one of Kashmiris. In the 18th century, the latter reached the Tibetan capital via the route that took off from Patna and crossed the Newar states of Patan, Batgaon, and Kathmandu. In most European accounts of Kashmir, its people have not been noticed as a sophisticated trading community, and the only references I've found in 19th or 20th century sources to Kashmiri businessmen outside Kashmir refer to their presence in Lhasa, Leh, and Yarkand. Yet in the 18th century, they had a reputation for far-flung mercantile activity, to the extent of even being compared to those widely spread trading communities, Armenians and Jews. Apart from their presence in the principal cities of Tibet, it was noticed in the 1720s that they had shops and offices in Kathmandu, and 50 years later, Kashmiris still had their establishments in Tibet, often acting as middlemen in Tibet-China commerce. They are also reported to have had agencies all over India, from the Coromandel coast to Bengal and Benares. Overland trade was sensitive to political events and situations. In the 17th and early 18th centuries, the Mughal and Safavid empires adopted policies designed to stimulate trade and paralleled by a similar desire on the part of Muscovite Russia. That development of routes, development of caravanserais. Conversely, a change in political control could close a bustling route. When in the third quarter of the 18th century, Nepal's Newar states, which had had a long and friendly association with Tibet, based largely on trade, were overrun by the Gurkhas, the route across them from Patna and leading to Shigatse, Gyangse, and Lhasa became unavailable to foreign traders. This was the easiest route between the Indian plains and Tibet. Its closure, therefore, involved a huge reduction in the trade between the two regions. Clearly, the political situation would often determine the choice of route. And I think I can do it. In the early 1830s, for instance, Kashmir shawls bound for Iran, which had previously been carried over land via Kandahar, were now, quote, in consequence of anarchy, unquote, going by sea via Bombay and Bushehr. The merchants on the routes northwest of India would usually join together in armed caravans controlled by a caravan magnate, Rais. These bosses were skilled in political relations with the ferocious hill potentates who controlled the routes. This was equally true of parts of the Ottoman Empire. In Iraq, the perils of the road necessitated travel in armed caravans, sometimes, as in the passage of the Khyber Pass, and on the Baghdad-Aleppo route, the caravans had to purchase the protection of local tribes. So this has been an overview. We've had, or the latter part of my talk, and it has dovetailed, I hope, with Anita's to some extent. But it came to an end. In general, from at least the early 17th to the mid-19th centuries, trade between India and Central Asia flourished. And I should say trade overland between different regions of Central Asia. By around 1850, however, the effects of European, especially British and perhaps Russian economic imperialism were well on their way to undermine indigenous productivity and commerce, and the traditional trades took a further hit with the development of communications technologies, especially the building of roads and railways. It was a slow withering. The Trans-Karakoram trade continued in an attenuated form until the 1940s. The Trans-Karakoram trade continued in an attenuated form until the 1940s, and the Trans-Himalayan trade in subsistence commodities continued till nearly 1960. And as always, it was political developments, respectively China's communist revolution and its occupation of Tibet, that gave the coup de grace to these last vestiges of the system of commerce that had underpinned Asia's prosperity for centuries. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rizvi. I would now like to call on Professor Gitanjali Surendran to speak. She'll be speaking on a Buddhist Bay, mobility and the making of Buddhism in India circa 1890 to 1956. So, Professor Surendran. Oh, there you go. I should also say that I think are going to be privileged because her forthcoming book is called Democracy's Dhamma, Buddhism in the Making of Modern India circa 1850 to 1956.
Thank you. So yes, I'm going to jump right into it because I know we have time shortage. I'm also very conscious of the fact that as Maya and I have discussed, we're the last two speakers of this very long, very intense, very interesting conference. So I'm going to jump right into it. Yesterday, a member of the audience had a question about how Buddhism was so mobile that so many, large numbers of Central Asians, Southeast and East Asians and beyond have converted to Buddhism over the last millennium. In a sense, this question is very critical and I'm not really going to be able to answer it. But I think that mobility has very much been part of the, of Buddhism sort of post. Okay, should have worn my heels. So mobility has been very much part of Buddhism's post-Buddha story. We all know about the, Ashoka's emissary, the Mauryan emperor, 2nd century BCE. His emissaries, his sort of efforts at Buddhist proselytization, that's sort of more famous. Yesterday, Professor Kitanov was talking about the Central Asian nomadic groups that also converted within about 1,000 years of this. So it's very much at the heart of that story. It's also very much, I'm talking about mobility here, at the heart of the modern story. And today I'm going to present just a few vignettes, as it were, to illustrate this and see where that sort of takes us. And I have an argument about shared Buddhism, which I will share with you in a minute. So why this title? Sunil Amrit has calculated that about 30 million people left India's shores between 1850s till the 1930s. 27 million of them went to just 3 British colonies, Ceylon, Burma, and Malaya. You will note that 2 of those are at this point in this period in the throes of a certain kind of Buddhist revival, as it were. This quite large number of mobile Indians should draw our attention to the importance of colonial India's neighborhood in modern India's story, especially the story of the new avatar of Buddhism in 20th century India. Interestingly, many of those 27 million people returned to India, no doubt, carrying ideas, things, and valuable experience from these parts of the empire. A colleague of mine who works on the Coromandel coast and Tamil labor, moving from that coast to these areas, to Burma and to Malaya, actually thinks that as they're returning, they're carrying certain ideas of Buddhism, and so there's an astonishing number of reform societies or Buddhist societies that are set up in the early and mid 20th century, advocating lower caste conversion to Buddhism, and that's something that their experience of these Buddhist societies has something to do with that. It's not been fully worked out yet, but it's, I think, an important suggestion. So the Bay of Bengal acts as a kind of connective tissue, facilitating all kinds of Buddhist traffics. We heard stories of Buddhists traveling outside of India to Tibet and Southeast Asia and beyond, and their influence there yesterday. I think it's worth pointing out that for the modern period at least, this story partly tracks the reverse traffic. That is the role of the Burmese, Ceylonese, and other Southeast Asians in India's 20th century Buddhism. In fact, so significant is this Buddhist traffic, I would say, across the Bay of Bengal, across its warm waters, that it could very well be described as a Buddhist bay. The story begins with this figure, Anagarika Dharmapala. He was born Don David Hevavitharna in 1864 in Colombo. He was from a quite wealthy family and was exposed to the activities of the super monks, Migitavata Gunananda and Hikadove Sumangala, as well as the Theosophical Society. Both the founders, Henry Steele Olcott and Helena Blavatsky, were his mentors, as was Edwin Arnold, who wrote that runaway bestseller, The Light of Asia, about which Jairam Ramesh has recently written. In 1891, he travels to India on his own for the first time, and he travels with a Japanese companion monk known as Kozen Gunaratna. In Japan, he is later known as Shaku Kozen. Richard Jaffa has written about him. And they travel to Bodh Gaya, to the Mahabodhi temple. And there, Dharmapala has an epiphany. He vows right there and then, as he knelt before the Vajrasan, and this is in his own words more or less from his diaries, to ensure that the temple would return to Buddhist control. Obviously, that's a very complicated campaign, and I don't really have time to talk about it. But suffice it to say that he hoped through this campaign to forge a Buddhist world, particularly a Buddhist Asian consciousness, as it were, and to revive Buddhism in the land of its birth, where the argument was it had more or less disappeared. Obviously, there's a lot of controversy over that as well. Doug Ober has recently written countering this argument, or rather this narrative. So India emerges in this period in the Buddhist imagination as a kind of holy land to which, for the first time really, Buddhists must conduct pilgrimage. Dharmapala started the Mahabodhi Society. He quickly moved the headquarters from Colombo to Calcutta to translate his vision. And those of you who have seen the exhibition that's accompanying this conference outside in the quadrangle would realize that the Mahabodhi Society became quite a significant spokesbody, as it were, for Buddhist South Asians by the 1950s. So in conjunction with colonial archaeology, this is a complicated story, many of you would be aware of it, the Mahabodhi Society begins to champion Buddhist pilgrimage in the early 20th century. The four main sites were identified by this time: Lumbini, Sarnath, Bodh Gaya, and Kushinagar, and more sites were to follow. So a sense of Buddhist sacred geography, as we've heard in the last couple of days, one way or another, is not at all new to the modern age. It had existed for most of Buddhist history. In fact, we know sacred geographies were shifting terrains on the Indian subcontinent prior to our current period. And Buddhists from afar had long known that India was an important part of the Buddha's life story. But either India was entirely accessible, or accessible but too risky, or the Buddha wasn't in an important enough local sort of deity of Buddhist practice, and so India remained distant. For most Buddhists, but not all. There are a significant number of travelers too. The British archaeological and philological investigations of the modern period settled some questions around Buddhist places in India and brought India nearer. The British experience of colonialism brought India nearer via the transport revolution, the translation revolution. A large number of Buddhist texts are being translated and coming to light and are being popularized in a certain way. My advisor used to call another set of books the sort of practical canon of Buddhism. So these would include people like Christmas Humphreys, Edward Thompson, etc. T.W. Rhys-Davids. These books on Buddhism also have a huge market in the West and are being translated in other languages too. So there are two kinds of translations happening here. So for the first time, we see many more pilgrims coming to India. They begin as a trickle in the 1910s, and then the numbers get larger and larger, and today run into the millions. Now, these pilgrims have their own effect. They're each carrying something. They're kind of a very dense node of sort of activity. People like Bodhanand Mahasthavir, who was a Bengali monk settled in Lucknow, carrying out lower caste conversions to Buddhism there in the 1920s and 30s, actually came to learn about Buddhism during his time in Benares, interacting with Sri Lankan monks who had come to see Sarnath. And there are many stories like this, including of Rahul Sankrityayan. Again, picking up on something that was said yesterday, travel and mobility is significant in that in order for Buddhist pilgrims, for instance, to do it, there had to be an imagination of a Buddhist homeland. And as I said earlier, that imagination had been present prior to the 20th century too, but it's in the 20th century that we see it translated into action on scale. Numerous pilgrim essays, guides begin to emerge in the first decades of the 20th century, and the Mahabodhi Society's role in popularizing these is critical. A lot of them, the essays are carried in their journal, which has a fair bit of circulation. I've seen it in many parts of the Buddhist world in small libraries. The Buddhist gaze of the Mahabodhi Society and variety with authors, travelers, monks, scholars serve to generate Buddhist landscapes in the eyes of the public through their descriptions of Buddhist-inspired travels. This was often to the neglect of what existed prior in those areas, right? So successful were these efforts that as early as 1901, when Dharmanand Kosambi, the Buddhist traveler, scholar, Gandhian, and a very important, significant Marathi public intellectual, arrived in Bodh Gaya, he actually expressed surprise that the locals that he encountered had no knowledge of Buddhism. Okay. Now, Dharmapala, I'm just going to take a small detour just to indicate that mobility is a part of many figures, including the ones that we sort of, in a sense, take for granted. We know that Vivekananda, for instance, goes to the World Parliament of Religions, and he becomes quite famous through that travel and that connection, and comes back to India with that, with that reputation. Sitting to his right, actually, and I stumbled on this magazine in the IIC library. I took a quick picture. It's of course the organizer, as you can see, and sitting to his right is actually Dharmapala. So both of these two became quite famous. We are more familiar with Vivekananda because of the India story, but Dharmapala is quite famous in the sort of Sri Lankan historiography, and he too gains his reputation initially at the World Parliament of Religions. Now, the two had an interesting relationship. Initially, they were both mistakenly hopeful of each other's support in their respective projects of, Buddhist revival and the kind of popularization of Vedanta. But it was precisely issues like the Mahabodhi temple campaign that sullied the waters. Interestingly, both also have similar legacies in their association with assertive nationalist religion. Now, why I'm bringing this up is partly just to highlight the kind of importance of mobility to a number of characters in the modern period too, where somewhat we take it for granted, but also because it indicates, Dharmapala quickly moves, as I said, the Mahabodhi Society headquarters to Calcutta, and he has to be quite careful what he's doing there because his public there is predominantly Hindu, Brahmin, Bhadralok, right? Now, one of the things that Dharmapala does, I've leaped ahead, but anyway. One of the things that Dharmapala does in his own prolific travels is he issues these calls to the heads of Buddhist communities everywhere to send volunteers to India to settle these Buddhist sites. In response to one such call, Shin Chandra, this elderly gentleman on the left, but I'm talking about him in his youth, a young Samanera or renunciate, comes with 30 other pilgrims from Burma, from the Arakan, to visit Bodh Gaya. This is in the late 19th century, the last decade. But circumstances are difficult. They face great hostility and terrible living conditions, and so he goes back along with the rest of the group. But then he feels ashamed. So he comes back again to try again, and in 1894 he's in Calcutta, and he's learning Pali and Sanskrit under the watchful eye of another very interesting mobile personality who was a former 1857 rebel, a wrestler, and a Buddhist monk. He became Buddhist when he ended up in Sri Lanka, or Ceylon at that point, by the name of Mahavir Swami. Eventually, he moves with Mahavir Swami to Kushinagar. He's ordained there by Mahavir Swami in 1903, and he's ordained as Chandramani, and that is obviously a picture of him as Chandramani on the left. And he succeeds Mahavir in Kushinagar as the abbot there. He died in 1970, so he really lived a long life. He spent most of that in India. On and off, he helped the Mahabodhi Society and Dharmapala with various matters, including the Mahabodhi temple case. He was a master strategist of sorts in kind of generating Kushinagar as a kind of international Buddhist pilgrimage site. He would organize Vaishak Day celebrations every May. That's Buddha Jayanti or Buddha Purnima. In May every year. He would start with a puja, then he would have a procession with a bunch of colorful procession with lots of monks circling around the town in full view of a huge commercial fair that would be organized to coincide with it, so that everybody who's there is witness to this kind of Buddhist performance of the town's Buddhist history. But in his time in India, he oversees another really landmark event, and that is the conversion to Buddhism of B.R. Ambedkar, who needs very little introduction. He's of course the chief draftsman of the Indian Constitution. On 14th October 1956, he converts. And it's actually U. Chandramani who presides over that ceremony. He administers the 3 precepts and the 3 refuges and the 5 precepts. He's right there in the corner on the left of that photograph. You can see Ambedkar and his wife and his associates. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. Now, we don't actually have, I'll return to the Ambedkar moment in a second. We don't have any, very much evidence of U. Chandramani's own feelings about his long career in India, the hardships he must have endured. And he wasn't the only monk to come from Burma either, to settle in India. There were so many others. Just to mention a few, U. Ottama, who is Burma's early nationalist, had a long association with India. He was a student here during Swadeshi, and then he was close enough to the Indian nationalists that he was deputed by the Indian National Congress to represent them at Sun Yat-sen's funeral in 1926. And he often talked about educational, economic, political, and religious regeneration in Buddhist terms, and spent a lot of time in India. U. Paragu was another person who came in the 40s and 50s. He learned Hindi in India, another monk. And actually what influenced him most was a visit to Tagore's Shanti Niketan, so that when he went back to Rangoon, he set up the U. Paragu Shanti Niketan library and lived a very long life, translated numerous texts into Hindi, including a very interesting one on Ashoka. Now I turn very quickly to the travel of relics. I'm just giving you one example. There are many examples of this, but as we know, for those of you who visited the exhibition, the travel of relics is something that is new, actually. It's, the fact that it's taken out of the stupas and now traveling is huge. The Sanchi relics had been taken back to London, and they were in a vault in the V&A, by all accounts. In 1932, the British mission of the Mahabodhi Society begins to agitate, as it were, petition. Agitate is a strong word, petition for the repatriation of the Sanchi relics. And they finally got a concession later that year. Obviously, the museum authorities were quite upset and didn't know what to do with this demand, but they were allowed to do a bit of worship in a hall where the relics were taken out and displayed. So on the 13th of November, this is precisely what happened. Eventually, in fact, the V&A does agree under some pressure, including threats on the parts of petitioners that there would be agitation in India, Burma, and Ceylon if they did not return the relics. And they agreed to this in 1939, so it took some time, but of course the war got in the way, and finally the relics only begin their journey back in 1947, and they arrive, late 1946, they arrive in March 1947, actually in Colombo. This is a picture of the UNS Tir, which brings the relics from Colombo to Calcutta. It's in January 1949. The relics were received by the first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, and by the President of the Mahabodhi Society, Shyama Prasad Mukherjee. From then on, their travel itinerary is quite incredible. UNU, the first Prime Minister of Burma, comes personally to take the relics back to Burma, and alongside the tooth relic, which is also on a visit to Burma at the same time, in early 1950, they travel around Burma. And later on, UNU writes to Shyama Prasad Mukherjee to say, this is evidence of the spiritual union of the 3 countries with India as the land of Buddhism's birth, but Ceylon and Burma as the preservers of Buddhism. The relics were interred, so this is the photograph of the interment. Sorry, I have to lift this up. So the relics were interred in the Mahabodhi Society's Chaitagiri Vihara, which is built with the help of the Nawabs of Bhopal, as well as the Society's benefactors and some support from the ASI. Among the international dignitaries present, there's UNU. He's carrying in this photograph the relics on his head. Shyama Prasad Mukherjee is to his right, and Nehru is standing behind trying to control crowds, apparently. And again, there's a lot of ceremony involved. Like I said, this is not the first time this has happened. Sarnath already had an enshrinement in 1931, and there was an enshrinement in 1920, and there were other smaller enshrinements as well. But these were 3 that were led by the Mahabodhi Society. And I'm focusing on this one because it's in that crucial period in the 1950s, post-independence. Now, through all this emerged a discourse of shared Buddhism. Through these kinds of exercises in relic diplomacy, but also through the government-sponsored 2,500th year celebration of Buddha Purnima, or Buddha Jayanti, in 1956, we have an idea that Buddhism, though Indian in quite nationalist terms, was nonetheless something that India shared with other countries. Significantly, this discourse of a shared Buddhism prompted Asian Buddhists to take an interest in the Mahabodhi temple dispute, in the archaeological discoveries and relics, and in the condition of Indian Buddhists. And for some post-independence leaders, shared Buddhism became a basis for new diplomatic relationships as well. So I'll turn to my last example here. Oops, that's Chaitagiri Vihara. Just to return to Ambedkar. So, of course, we know about Ambedkar's conversion, what he does on the 14th of October. What we might not be so aware of is that, he, in fact, travels as a kind of preparation for this conversion. He travels to Rangoon, Colombo, in fact, multiple times sometimes, to sort of see Buddhism in action. Apparently, his first conversion was in Colombo in 1950, although he didn't feel the time was right to, and so he denied it later. But he really felt that the rest of the Buddhist world, especially the Burmese and the Sri Lankans, were very important to this project, and without their support, Buddhist conversion wouldn't succeed. I'm sure am I nearing, how am I doing on time?
2 minutes.
Okay, great. So, I have another picture here. So you might recognize the figure on the right, that is E.V. Ramaswamy Naikar, whom he meets in 1954 in Rangoon. This is at the International Buddhist Conference, where he appealed to the Sasana Council to support his efforts for lower caste conversion. And there he repeated a demand he made everywhere that he went for a single gospel. And to this he added that there should be a baptism-like Buddhist conversion ceremony, a Buddhist religious seminary, appointment of lay preachers, and congregational worship on Sundays, etc. So he made a case for building larger Buddhist temples and all kinds of things, educational institutions and so on, and he was hoping for this support. Now, after his conversion, like many modern Buddhists, Ambedkar went on pilgrimage to the Buddhist sites. After addressing the World Fellowship of Buddhists conference in Kathmandu, almost his last really public address, although he had 1 or 2 more smaller ones, before his death, again, from there he went to Lumbini. From Lumbini, they flew to Patna, took a train to Bodh Gaya, then they went to Sarnath, and finally he ended in Kushinagar. He ended that journey in Kushinagar on 26 November, where U Chandramani arranged his stay, and apparently he knelt before the statue of the Buddha there, and with tears streaming down his face. He was very moved. And like all modern Buddhists, he had completed the important pilgrimage. Now, there are many other examples I can take to bolster my argument that a shared discourse of Buddhism is crucial to modern Indian Buddhism. And that it emerges as a result of this tremendous mobility across the Bay of Bengal, but I'll leave that for maybe Q&A if we have a chance. There is, of course, another side to this story of how ancient historical Buddhism provided language and a vocabulary for discussion of modern political, social, and religious ideas in India, but that story is for another day. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call on Dr. Maya Joshi to speak and also take the opportunity to mention here she's a translator as well as a writer, of course, and her latest publication is an edited version as the editor of Volga Se Ganga, the journal.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here at this hour. So I don't have the kinds of histories that have been shared so far in the session. I'm going to deal with one person's history, but he is not a simple person. It's one man, many lives, and it touches upon practically all the regions we've talked about in the last 2 days. So that itself, I think, calls for a certain attention being drawn to this extraordinary figure. 1893 to 1963 are his dates, and in those 70 years he lived several lives. I have spoken on him earlier, thanks to Ambassador Shamsaran at the IIC, but that took 1.5 hours. So in 20 minutes I'll try to do some justice to capturing some of this. Apart from the maritime history, I think practically every other region and every other mode of travel and every other history occurs in the life of Rahul Sankrityayan. It's a river. He himself is a writer of riverine stories and explores mountainscapes. His own life is like a river, and there's something oceanic really about his reach. The other metaphor that comes to mind is the elephant and the blind men, because I find that no individual reading of him has actually done justice to him yet. So that's my ongoing project, and it's been going on for about 20 years. That should tell you something. Okay, so the Russian Revolution, the two World Wars, and the Cold War are the historical contexts for his life. He's very responsive to all of these. And then there are these local contexts, the Indian anti-colonial movement and the peasant movements in which he plays a part. He starts off as a traditional, he's born in a small village called in Azamgarh district of Uttar Pradesh, to a very traditional Orthodox Brahmin family of rural cultivators. Runs away from home at the age of 11, is brought back several times, but eventually manages to run away in a search for knowledge, he says. The first school he goes to is a madrasa in Azamgarh, and he wants to study Sanskrit. So he lands up he first goes to Calcutta, then he goes to Banaras, and acquires a very traditional education from these spaces. He never went to a modern a university, and he never goes to an English. He does not get an English medium education. I think that's an important factor for understanding both his achievements and his limitations, perhaps. He is soon absorbed into a Vaishnav sampradaya, so much so that they want to make him a mathadhish, and he runs away from that because he doesn't want that kind of life of pursuit of petty power, which is what he sees, and eventually lands up with the Arya Samaj, because that seems to appeal more to his more rational proclivities. It's in the Arya Samaj, ironically, as a pracharak of the Arya Samaj, and of course he's very good with debate. He's very good with languages. And that's how the Arya Samaj proselytized. He becomes a very popular and powerful speaker because you engage with the opposing perspectives. In the course of which he comes across the Buddhist philosophical notions, because they're refuted. Except that there's no one and he's very curious about where they're coming from. What is the, he finds them more appealing to his reason. It's in the course of that he eventually becomes a Buddhist, and then later a Marxist. So meanwhile, there's this Indian freedom struggle going on. He's offering satyagraha. He's in jail. Quite a bit of his voluminous oeuvre, about 170 works, are produced in prisons, which were very productive spaces for these kinds of activities. He's a part of the story of the Buddhist revival. He's a part of the peasant movement in Bihar, and he's a founder member of the Bihar unit of the Communist Party. So the post-colonial nation, Nehruvian era, modernity, technology, these are all parts of his story. So who is or was Rahul Sankrityayan? These are some of the sort of frames within which he's been framed already. He's been called the father of Hindi travel writing. To Tibetologists, he is a scholar, explorer. There's a centenary stamp I'll show later, issued by the Postal Department, which commemorates that because it shows him there's a Tibetan landscape. He's an inspiration for the setting up of the Central Asian Studies Department at JNU. Professor Devendra Kaushik shared that with me because he writes the history of Central Asia in the 1940s. And in Hindi. It's extraordinary, the imagination behind that kind of, it's a 2-volume history for which he does research in the Soviet Union, and it eventually percolates into comes back to India. And I was invited by Professor Variku to speak at that center, and that's where I met Professor Devendra Kaushik, where he shared that the inspiration came from Rahulji. So there's that life. So there is also this, he's also called Nagnavadi Ved Nindak by one Swamiji, who's probably Swami Karpatriji, responding to this book, Volga Se Ganga, of which we brought out a fresh edition. The Victor Kiernan translation that used to be there had left out chapter 20, which is a very crucial chapter, so we've made sure that that's edited, that's included in this, and there's some other editorial additions here that will help readers. He's also the co-founder of the Bihar unit of the Communist Party, as I said, and produces considerable amount of party literature in the course of it. He's a fiery freedom fighter. There is a very powerful image of him in handcuffs, which is quite a iconic image. He produces what we call prison literature, but it's a vast genre-defying body of writing, which I'll come to later. And of course, he's been described as a cultural nationalist in a recent life history, which is something that I'm not entirely comfortable with, that framing. I suggest these frames instead. I think they present a more just representation of what we might want to do with his life. He's a polyglot, he's an autodidact, he's a traveler, explorer, polymath. You could think of him as an organic intellectual in the Gramscian sense. You could see him as a rooted cosmopolitan and an Indian internationalist. So that doesn't quite fit, in my view, with the cultural nationalist frame, which is an attempt to, I think, narrow some of his concerns. This is just a list of his names. There are several names that he acquired. He's born Kedarnath Pandey. So he's a traveler of him. He's a translator of himself, quite literally. When he becomes a sadhu, he becomes Sadhu Damodar Das. The Parsa Mutt in Bihar is where he is a sadhu. He also goes to Tirumishi in Tamil Nadu. He's still Sadhu Damodar Das. As an Arya Samaji Pracharak, he's Kedarnath Vidyarthi. And then in Sri Lanka, he becomes Rahul Sankrityayan. And this is the name that he takes on when he is ordained as a bhikshu. And it's a name he creates himself. Rahul, of course, Gautam Buddha's son. Sankrityayan, it should be. There's another Y and an A there missing. But there's Rahul Sankrityayan is the Apabhransh, in the Bhojpuri. He's also written 8 Bhojpuri plays, because part of his entire, effort was to reach the public. He wrote in a very accessible Hindi, and Bhojpuri, Bihar was his karma bhumi. That's where he cut his political teeth. And as a peasant leader, he realized the need to communicate with the peasantry, and he's a great advocate of minor languages, what we might call, the matribhasha, the mother tongues and the vernaculars, as they're called. So Sankirtyan is how he signs his name in those books. So that's so we might think of him as a Sanskrit-loving Pandit, which he's often constructed as, but there is this other side to him. He's very happy to be this, to break that down immediately if it leads to a more to social regeneration, which is what he's committed to. So these are the labels and titles that he acquires: Sadhu, Bhikkhu, Tripitakacharya, because in Sri Lanka he becomes master of the Tripitaka, the three baskets of the Pali tradition, and the title of Mahapandit is given to him by the Pandits of Banaras, Varanasi, for his service to Sanskrit. He loved Sanskrit. He knew about 30 odd languages according to one count, and of course he's comrade Rahul for the Marxists. So this is Vidyalankar Perivena. Following him, I landed up in Sri Lanka. I wanted to see if they still remember him. This is the oldest monastic college, and this is where he went to study, because he couldn't. So he met Bodhananda Mahastavir, of course, and he wanted to study Buddhism. He was very curious, and there was no one to teach him Buddhism. So his story is also the story of the sort of forgetting, the amnesia about Buddhism in India, and the need to then go to a Buddhist country to study. So he goes to Sri Lanka, and he teaches Sanskrit there and studies Pali. He also teaches himself French and German in order to read the Orientalists, the Orientalist scholarship, because he learns that they are the ones who are doing work on Buddhism. This is a monk showing me the room. This room here is the room that he stayed. It's kind of locked now, but they still remember him, and it's quite an institution. So is there a linear movement, or are there overlapping subjectivities? It's a bit of both. In 1917, the revolution inspires 22वीं सदी, his very powerful and interesting futuristic fiction, which I have translated, and it's been published in an anthology on South Asian science fiction, the Golan's Book of Science. It's quite amazing. This is his first major work, and it is set in exactly 100 years from now, 2124, right? It's called 22वीं Sadi, and it is imagining a utopia which has traces of a little bit of the Arya Samaj, a little bit of the Buddhism that's already, he's already becoming Buddhist in the early 20s, even though he's not yet gone to Sri Lanka. This is written in a prison as a satyagrahi. And it's inspired, he says, by the Russian Revolution, but he didn't know much about it. He would write much later that he was not educated enough to, he didn't know anything about socialism. But he whips up this amazing fantasy, which is quite extraordinary because it's very futuristic. It's thinking of a casteless society. It's using technology to get rid of caste. There's collective farms. The men and women are equal. Farmers are, traveling in trains and debating. They're reading philosophy. The world is connected. There are no wars, and there is a 4-hour workday. It's really quite exceptional. And the amazing, he's actually anticipating, email and so on. He's anticipating a whole lot of things in sitting in prison. This village-grown boy who never had this, technical education, shall we say. So quite extraordinary. So there it is. He's dreaming up a kind of Marxist utopia but there is also Nalanda resurrected in that story. The hero is a teacher. His name, he is a teacher from Nalanda who goes to sleep and wakes up 200 years later into this utopia. But he has lessons for them. He essentially tells them that, it's not good to rest on your laurels and you must constantly evolve, which is fascinating. So it's a journey backwards and forwards. Even as he's anticipating the future, he's also going back to the past for inspiration. Nalanda has been resurrected as a very secular institution of learning where the latest research is going on, in his imagination. Vishwa Guru of a sort, but of a different kind. So in the early 30s, while wearing the robes of a Buddhist monk, he travels with Ananda Kausalyayan, sent by from Sri Lanka. They go to England. And this duality manifests itself, where he's also paying homage to Marx's grave. This is while he's wearing a Buddhist robes, monks, and they also, of course, see the relics of Shariputra and Maudgalyayan, the two disciples of the Buddha. In his biographical essay on Bhadant Bodhanand Mahasvathavir, who was mentioned, he talks about how he could finally study all of this and how he, this is about his intellectual growth and the travels. I became devoted to the Buddha and his teachings. I became an atheist, an Anishwarvadi Nastik, right? Beyond the Buddha, at the next level, I found Marx. Materialism became my philosophy, but my mind continued to be drawn towards the graciousness of the Buddha's personality. So there's a very interesting duality there. The literary output is pretty enormous. There are about 160 odd books in 36 odd languages, according to Prabhakar Machwe. But the autobiography itself runs into several volumes, which I've looked at very carefully. There's travel writing, which I'll talk about. Ghumakkari Shastra, of course, is a treatise for travelers, where he theorizes travel and kind of nomadology before the French, kind of made it fashionable. He's doing a lot of things before they become fashionable. He's doing intertextual, he's doing, interdisciplinarity before it's fashionable. He's doing decolonial thinking, I think, before it's fashionable. Anyhow, biographies of Buddha, Saraha, Sinhala, Ghumakkar, Marx, Engels, Mao, Stalin. It's just extraordinary, the range. Memoirs include his memoirs with his political, the fellow prisoners, Mere Asahयोग ke Sathi. Essays and polemics, Naye Bharat ke Naye Neta, Vivid Prasang, Tumhari Kshay, Ram Rajya aur Marxwad, very interesting. Histories of Central Asia, particularly Madhya Asia ka Itihas, which is very relevant for us. He's doing this, the research is being done between 42 and 44, that early. And it won the Sahitya Academy Award. It was published by the Sahitya Academy. Philosophy, there's an enormous survey of world philosophy called Darshan Digdarshan, also written in the early 40s, where he has, it's about 600 pages long, about 200 pages are devoted to Islamic philosophy. And it's quite extraordinary. When we talk about decoloniality today, we talk about, we must recognize the Eastern traditions. He's looking at the influence of Islamic philosophy on European thought, the debt that Europeans owe to that. So it's quite extraordinary in Hindi, right? So Darshan Digdarshan, 600 pages, and looking at the entire thing, starting with ancient Greece, ancient India, coming all the way up to Bergson, as a history of human engagement with philosophical concepts. If that is not decolonial, I don't know what it is. Without worrying about whether this is post-colonial, this is whatever. It's just everybody is on the same page, and these are all minds engaging with the same philosophical questions. It's quite extraordinary in the very audacity of its. This is being written in a unfree India. This is being produced in 1942. He's in a British jail while writing this. Historical fiction from Volga to Ganga, which I mentioned earlier, probably his best known work. It's been translated into several Indian languages, continues to be read. If you read the English version, kindly get hold of this one, which has a chapter 20. Singh, Senapati, Bandhulmal, these are very interesting characters that also come in Volga to Ganga. There are 8 Bhojpuri plays, and there are several translations, including sort of technical work, because he knew the languages to work in them, including some of the texts that he brought back from Tibet. So Dharmakirti's Praman Vartika is, of course, one of the major ones. There are 6 Tajik novels. That's the fascinating thing about him. He'd learned Urdu, of course. He went to madrasa. He studied Persian and Arabic later. And while waiting for a visa to the Soviet Union, because it was Stalinist Russia, he's waiting for months and months and months. So what does he do? He just takes hold of this Tajik novelists' novels and translates them, 6 of them. Later, he would meet his son in Russia, that novelist's son. So it's quite extraordinary, the range. So these are just the travelogues. It's a list of his travelogues. I don't know if you can read, you can just tell the regions from, Tibet, Europe, Ladakh, Kinnaur, the inner reaches of the Himalayas, of course, Garhwal. Very interesting kind of ethnography being done. I see it as a kind of non-colonial gazetteer, being produced in Hindi, because he notes everything, and he's very quick to pick up the languages as well. So, yeah.
Okay.
5 minutes? 2 minutes?
2.
Okay, 2. Wait, this is not moving. Yeah. So, Ghumakkari, which is, of course, this is the lead motif of his autobiography. Sair kar duniya ki ghafil, zindagani phir kahan. Zindagi kar kuch rahi to naujawani phir kahan. This keeps coming up. So he's recommending sair, travel, as a mode of being in the world. So it's a carpe diem message, but it's, sort of very... Ghumakkar Shastra, of course, is the text that I really needed to talk more about. This is a play on the idea of Shastras. It's a tongue-in-cheek text, therefore, because it's not a Shastra. But he's basically saying Ghumakkari is the Param Dharma. It's the highest, achievement. So he says, Buddha is the supreme Ghumakkar. This comes up, this question has been coming up again and again. Why is Buddhism so mobile? And he says that it's the freedom from the concerns with caste purity and the taboos against travel across the seas not being there. And he says, so it's the adaptability that he values. He mentions Shankaracharya, Guru Nanak, Columbus, and Darwin, because he says these are the people who brought modernity, and they, without their intrepid traveling, we wouldn't be where we are. So there's a modernist. Desh Gyan is another chapter where he says you must. This is written in the post-independent India, so we must know our country, and this is not tourism. This is travel the hard way, and on a minimal budget. It's a shoestring, adventurous travel that he's talking about. And then he talks about carrying the fragrance of one's soil as an ideal of response and responsibility for a good Ghumakkar. You must. So there is both a sense of being located in a particular place while being open to the world. So very interesting, there's also a strong sense of responsibility. So if there's Ghumakkar Shastra, which urged people to run away, and I have men in my own family who've been inspired to do that. His wife told me that people would write angry letters because they said our children have, our sons have run away because you've told them so. But there's also Bhago nahi duniya ko badlo. So don't run away, change the world. Volga se Ganga is again a fascinating, history of, and these are the sources that he's looking at. And the main themes really are mobility and miscegenation, and he's remapping, as it were, because it's 8,000 years of human history from Volga to Patna. It ends in Patna, in 1942 with a Dalit Air Force pilot flying plane over Japan, ruminating on how we have come all this way to fascism in 1942, right? So internationalism right there for you. And there's a debate about Gandhi, and it's a fascinating work. There's no time to go into all of that. Of course, Dharmakirti is famous. This is the stamp. Really unfortunate, the image there. But you know, it's very unflattering. I've seen a giant version of it at his home, and it's even worse there. But you can see the fact that they picked on the Tibetan journeys, to sort of celebrate him. This is him as a monk. Just some images. This is him in Tibet with the texts. More visits to Tibet. This is just to show you the sartorial transformations also. This is probably him in Europe. This is the famous, this is him writing, probably in Mussoorie at his home. There's a bust in Darjeeling where he passed his last years. And this is a recent drawing that we've used for our edition. Very interesting, I thought, with the way it works with symbolism. I want to just end with, so these are just some of the people whose lives he, touches. Gedun Chopel, fascinating person. We need a separate talk on him. And of course, Sherbatsky, who invited him to Russia to teach Buddhist philosophy, famous scholar on Buddhist logic. Rorik also appears. There's his letter from Yuri Rorik, his son, to him. And we end with, so this is a Chinese translation of Volga Se Ganga that I found at the Library of Congress, and this is an image of Dange. So there is this other world as well, so traveling texts. His texts have also been translated. I just want to end with this last quotation from Majjhim Nikaya Buddhist text, which he uses and which he adapts and uses as the epigraph to his autobiography. I have taken ideas as a raft to carry me across, not as a load to be borne on the head. So the very notion of mobility, mutability, evolution, acceptance of change. So he's relating it to the Buddha's message of not reifying ideas and people. So I just end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I must say I've held my tongue so far because I didn't want to get jinxed, and I didn't. We smack on time, 1 minute over, but that's forgiven. So thank you very much. I think we've seen two sets of presentations. One which talks about mobility in the interests of trade, specifically between South Asia and Central Asia, and vice versa. And the other one is sort of intellectual journeys, both individual as well as collective, in the process of state and perhaps nation building that we've gone through. So I saw this as a very interesting sort of paradigm that we are faced with. We have a full 20 minutes for questions, which is the bonus that we get for being on time. The only question, the only sort of thing is that if you have any comments to make, I would ask you to please hold it until all the questions are done with, and the questions as brief as possible, please, without being prefaced by a comment. Thank you. Yes, ma'am. यहाँ पे दे दो. There it is.
Well, I just have a very short question for you. This book, Darshan and Dig Darshan, has that been translated?
No.
No.
Most of his work hasn't been translated.
Why not?
That's the problem. We need to do it.
Yeah.
So I'm doing it a little bit at a time. I've translated his first work, and I'm sort of working on something else now.
Yeah, I mean, there should be a host of scholars to attend.
160 to go.
And Pramana Vartik has been translated
No, that of course.
into what? Into Hindi? What did he do?
He worked on a tippani, a tika of it, a commentary on it. But he also taught it in English and Russian, which he learned.
Excuse me, right there.
Yeah, Gitanjali, I want to know about the conversion of lower caste people from Hindus, particularly to Buddhist Buddhism, it's very commonly happening. Earlier it was happening to Christianity. They were given some incentives like hand pen woman. Poor people were given food, educated were given some jobs, and rich people were given women. So how they are attracted with this? Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Is that on? Yeah. Okay. So, actually, the first recorded conversion in the modern period is in 1898, and it's led by Pandit Ayoti Thas in Madras. And Henry Olcott is actually asked to preside over a Paraya conversion, so lower caste conversion in Madras presidency. It's often referred to as a failed conversion. I don't know very much more about it. Dharmapala was present at that. And I don't think there was these kinds of incentives being offered, but the incentive of self-respect and kind of an exit from the caste system. And that's one of the, so through this period you see Bodhanand Mahastavir, for instance, has come up a few times in the 1920s and 30s, also carrying out lower caste conversions in in the United Provinces. You have some mention of this in the Bombay presidency as well. And of course the next major conversion is the one in 1956. So in the modern era, that narrative is very much about converting out of the caste system, into a religio philosophy, theological religio philosophy, which allows for lower caste folk to be equal and to take their rightful place in society and eventually in democracy. So
okay, thank
that
you.
Narrative is there.
Right here. For, microphone. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. My questions to Maya Joshi, two related questions. And I'm wondering if they're related because my question is, why does he write in Hindi, having known all these languages that you talk about? And related to that is, there were everywhere they went between the Buddhists and the non-Buddhists, the Hindus. There were debates in the villages, excuse me, talking about why one is better than the other or not better than the other. One sees also the Buddhist monk U Ottama being part of this debate. So is that linked? I mean, is he writing in Hindi? Is he participating in these debates? And is that the reason why he chooses Hindi?
Yeah, so I think there is this, for him, Hindi is really in the world he comes from, so he's an Uttar Pradesh person, right? So he's writing for people, masses. He thinks of English as the elite, yeah, elite. It's not so much foreign, it's the elitism of it, yeah? So it's accessibility, which is why Bhojpuri, and the themes are all, peasant, women, Mehraru ke Dukh, one of them is called, So it's really trying to reach the people who need to be reached. I think that's how he sees it. And he says that I have tried to write, and it's a very humble perspective he has on his own writing. He says others will come and, So, yeah. But he works in Sanskrit and Tibetan, and he writes his diary in Sanskrit, actually. There are very interesting reasons for that, which I don't want to go into.
Yes. Yes. Not yet. After that, I'll call on you.
Thanks to all the panelists. Very, very fascinating. My name is Ravi Bhuthalingam. I see that two of the panelists have focused on trade, one on Buddhism, and I think, Maya, you covered a very fascinating character who's got parts of many things. So my question is this: we tend to see trade journeys as just trade, religious journeys as just religious. Now, considering that these were difficult geographies and not easy to go across, is it not possible that all these travelers, there was some sort of cooperation, symbiosis amongst them? For example, they would have traveled together on a caravan which was traveling through these dangerous parts, and therefore did Buddhism or any other religious tourism, religious, what is the right word, religious expedition, also serve a part in trade? And did trade indeed serve a part in propagation of these beliefs? So This kind of intertwining is what I'm asking about. Anybody who you feel.
Yeah.
I think that is true what you're saying. It's not something that I could really elaborate on very far, but I do know that a lot of, I don't know about a lot, but some Hajj pilgrims from Central Asia used to come through Ladakh by the Trans-Karakoram route, having attached themselves to trade routes, to trade caravans, to trade expeditions. And I think it's probably at an earlier stage, it may be true, but I can't, that Buddhism spread partly along, well, the trade routes were established, perhaps, and allowed the pilgrims and the scholars, they gave them a path to follow and possibly protection. I mean, I don't know enough about this, but I think that you're probably right.
I think it's also very right, because a lot of people, see it as just trade. But along with the trade caravans, there was always somebody who was a Buddhist or a Muslim, going to spread the word. And I think the modern equivalent of it is that when you go on a 747, chances are that 80-90% of it are traders, businessmen and women. And then there's that one professor who's either going to, visit grandchildren or do other things, and who carries along ideas with him or her.
Who's attending a conference.
So I think that's a paradigm that we have to look at. Yes, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to add two things. One is that actually piety and commerce go together quite well, and one of the ways it went together in this case, these gentlemen, these figures weren't traders, of course, but they're very much part of pushing pilgrimage trails and so on, and encouraging people to move, and that is actually funding the transport revolution. And Richard Jaffe talks about how important it was for a shipping line to open between Tokyo and Bombay in order to facilitate that traffic, and how that was funding itself. But the other thing is, there is a way in which in the early 20th century there are these renouncer ascetic type of figures everywhere. These men wanted to travel, they wanted to do Ghumakkari, they wanted to go out and see the world. It was a way of breaking social bonds as well, and domestic bonds that they felt stifled by. And so they just are, these figures particularly that I'm looking at, are not particularly interested in trade or commerce. They are very much interested in going out and being students and being politically involved and sort of being heroic and all of that. So there's also just that,
Okay. Peter.
I'd like to begin by thanking the panel for these 4 fascinating presentations, for really opening up this wonderful world to us. I have 2 questions, one to Gitanjali and one to Maya. Gitanjali, it's more a kind of clarification question. You mentioned Kosambi, and you called him a Marathi intellectual. Now, I'm not nitpicking, and I'm not being chauvinistic. I'm not nitpicking.
No, just by way of language.
Yeah, no, only because there was a huge debate. Not because he's gone, but because the Marathi intellectuals didn't accept him. The Marathi intellectuals didn't accept him. He was actually quite humiliated, and it's only when his scholarship in the Buddhist texts became well known and understood that he got elevated at the Bhandarkar Institute. So I just thought you may want to comment on that.
No, I don't know. I mean, I didn't get into Dharmanand Kosambi, although that's a paper in itself, right? Yeah, but I only meant it from the point of view of the language that he's writing, and he's writing very specifically, again, very much like Rahul Sankrityayan, who was, they overlap, although I don't think they're friends, in the language of the people. They did? So I hadn't...
In fact, that sort of sets the base for my second question.
No, that's his son. That's Didi.
No, I think it's a really fascinating, account of Rahul Sankrityayan that you've presented to us, and I want to know: did he actually cross paths with the Kosambis?
Yeah,
because there is such a common travel.
Sure.
In their lives.
Yeah, they met in Lahore in 1913. Dharmanand and he.
And therefore, these various avatars of his, I mean, were they superficial, or what is it? No, to be able to move from Buddhism to Marxism, there must have been something that drove him.
No. There is a. I mean, he writes about it. he writes about it. There's an entire. I mean, Buddhist socialism is a field in itself in Southeast Asia. There are many people like that. So it's not at all surprising that he should feel that way. This whole idea of primitive communism, the Sangha, so there is a whole body of literature on this, and he also engages with this Buddhist dialectics. There's a particular collection that People's Publishing House brought out, in which he has an essay called Buddhist Dialectics, in which he engages with this. For him, it remains an idealism. He says it's an Hegelian idealism because it doesn't get into dialectical materialism. But the dialectical method is shared. So he actually engages with it philosophically as well, and social. And then he engages. I've written about this also. There are many people who sort of talked about these overlaps. Thinking about even Ambedkar talks about it. In Nepal, in Kathmandu. Yeah, in Kathmandu, he speaks of Buddha or Karl Marx. So this is not at all a surprising sort of juxtaposition.
Yeah. Question for Maya again. Maya, you said something about how you saw Rahul Sankrityayan's sort of remarkable intellectual sort of the quality of his mind and the creativity as intrinsically linked to the fact that he wasn't formally schooled or didn't go to have colonial education.
That may have helped, I'm thinking.
Yeah. So that's exactly. I'm sure you've thought about it a little more, and that's why I wanted to draw you out. Ask you to sort of say a little bit more. And the reason I'm saying that is, as someone who's looked at the 19th century, the coming of English, and the making of sort of the bilingual relation and what print does to the linguistic economy. And the ways in which the early 19th century intellectuals, these are people who, were obviously kind of at home in so many different languages. And a couple of generations from then on, you know what's happened to sort of linguistic repertoires. And this is something, the kinds of loss this involves is something that we haven't even begun to think about. So it's in that context that I'm asking you to say a little bit more, because if you work on linguistic reorganization, the idea of linguistic minorities in a polyglot society like ours, what is this, okay. Look at what is happening.
All right, as long as it's not very long, because there are several questions.
Yeah, we can chat about it later. I think that's a very long discussion.
Go ahead.
No, we'll talk about it later.
All right.
Oh, Joya, no.
Oh, sorry. Right here. Yeah. And then you.
राहुल संस्कृत्यायन का तो कर्म क्षेत्र बिहार में था, सांकृत्यायन, सांकृत्यायन तो और उनका मतलब किसान आंदोलन में भी वो, तो स्वामी सहजानंद का जो किसान आंदोलन था उसमें भी वो पार्ट,
मैंने वो एक स्लाइड थी वो फटाफट कर दिया आगे। सहजानंद जी के साथ ही शुरू किया था उन्होंने, फिर हट गए थे, अलग हो गए थे, फिर वो कम्युनिस्ट हो गए थे।
Thank you very much. Actually, this question is addressed to Maya Joshi, but this whole panel was really superlative and like widening our horizons totally. I was wondering if when you were researching Rahul Sankrityayana's travels, and extensive travels all over Southeast Asia, up to Russia, and I don't know other places, maybe the West. But did you get and also in Tibet, did you get access to his letters? The letters written to, for example, Anand Kaushalya? Or
yeah, there are some
many letters that, or in the Mahabodhi Society in Sri Lanka, his correspondence with them, or with Sherbatsky,
yeah,
who wrote. I mean, this very important Buddhist scholar.
Yeah. No, they are around. Some have been collected and published also. Some of his letters have been collected and published.
Oh,
his correspondence.
So, I like to draw attention that lot has been said about Buddhism for the last 2 days, but one fact has been left out, and that is rise and fall of Buddhism, a rise and fall of Hinduism, rise and fall of Zoroastrianism and Marxism, but rise of Christianity, rise of Islam. What these philosophies, how they go up and down. What happened to Buddhism? It's been gone up and gone down. What were the causes? Why it happened so? Why it couldn't maintain its tempo? What went wrong? Where it went wrong?
Okay, thank
As
you.
it happened to other philosophies as well.
Thank you. Would either of you want to tackle that?
Thank you. I think that would need another seminar. There are so many views on this, so much has been written on it. People have, really thought about it. So.
No, I'm sorry. I've got Jyoti Malhotra right now, and then I'll talk to you. I realized there were no questions from the two ends, so I will. Thank you. Okay.
So the photograph of Anagarika Dharmapala and Swami Vivekananda. Now, did they know each other, or is one photobombing the other, or? And also the larger relationship between Buddhism and, I don't know, for want of a better phrase, the RSS or the antecedents of the RSS. What's the relationship between them?
Okay, so they did know each other. They got along quite well, actually, at the World Parliament of Religions. Swami Vivekananda referred to him in a letter as a good boy, although he's only about a year younger, who would help him with his mission. And Dharmapala also thought that Vivekananda would help him with his mission. And for some time they got along. He defended, Vivekananda came under some criticism in Calcutta, and Dharmapala actually defended him in Calcutta in the Minerva Theatre a few years later. Vivekananda was still in the US at that point. So they had a relationship, but they fall out. I mean, there's no question that they don't have a relationship by the end of Vivekananda's life. Why? Because they're both, the main issue is the Mahabodhi temple. Vivekananda doesn't feel that, he thinks that Dharmapala is going into fits over things Indian, quote unquote, and Dharmapala just keeps quiet because he doesn't want that response to become a big thing in Calcutta. So that's the main reason. But on the other questions, shall I just quickly touch on this?
Okay.
So on the other question of RSS and Buddhism, there's a lot to be said, actually, and the Hindu Mahasabha is very actively involved in the Mahabodhi temple case, and in fact is trying to work out a positive, like, sort of an accommodation between the Mahant of the Mahabodhi temple and Buddhism. But I'll be happy to, and the Mahabodhi Society, but I'll be happy to talk about that outside.
Yes.
Maya, I would like to ask you why Rahul Sankrityayan has been so ignored by the so-called intellectual elite of India.
One is simply language. One is simply the issue of language. He's not been, some of it has to do with the fact that it's not. Some of it is that it's been written, but my Hindi department invited me to speak on him from the English department. So even the Hindi walas don't always read him. I dug up, my college library had books 40 years old, which hadn't been borrowed in 40 years, written by him. And I kind of, so there is it's a very good question, and we need to think about why, and I have my own thesis, which will take more time.
Yes, Professor Rizvi.
So a very stimulating session, just like the other ones over the past 2 days. However, I have just one small query from Anita and Janet, because both of you talked about diaspora, and that too 18th, 19th, 20th century. I was just interested to know that there was another section of people from India who had migrated towards Kabul and towards Iran, where they had settled down and were carrying on trade and commerce, the Sikh community. In fact, now when all this issue arose, a large number of Sikhs had to leave Kabul and return back to the country. And we also know that in Iran, during the period when Reza Shah I had his revolution, whatever he called it, the white revolution or whatever, during that period of time, there was some persecution of the Indian Sikh community out there, and they were thrown out of that country. Can any or one of you, and they were all merchants and traders, so can Janet or Anita throw some light on that?
Thank you. I was so glad that trade and they get some questions. So, yes.
Well, I know that there was that Sikhs were part of the diaspora. I'm sorry, I don't know anything more about them, and I'm sorry I didn't even give them a mention. I should have.
Thank you. I'm sorry.
You know, I have to put up my hands and declare I'm a out-and-out centralationist. I was looking for Bukharan state structures, so, you know, the Shikarpuris came into my view. I've never done work on the Sikh community in Afghanistan. Of course they existed, and when, you know, people traveled, they encountered them, so they must have been there, and if you're saying so, there must have been a certain amount of persecution, but I've never studied them in detail, so I'm not really in a position to talk in detail about them.
Yes.
Thank you. I just want to thank this panel for having really taken us to a completely different level and of appreciation and understanding. My question is really to Maya. Maya, you make the presentation as if these various identities that Sankrityayan lived were very seamless, and yet you look at the torture, the internal struggle of the Buddha. Does that come through at all? The struggle, the internal conflict of these different identities that are impinging on his consciousness.
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's not all simultaneous. There is a seriality to it. You know, it's not as neat as some people have made out, but he sort of rejects one and then moves on to the other, but some residue remains. So, for instance, in Sri Lanka, when he's debating the question of, you know, does the Atma, you know, when he's leaving the Atmavad, and, you know, he talks about walking, you know, on the railway track, and he says, I was so deep in thought and it was so intense that I ran the risk of being run over by the train. And he describes it as an intense, you know, sort of self-questioning, and coming to it after having thought it through, that I can no longer believe in a soul, or a creator God, or the Vedas as authority, or whatever. You know, so there is a kind of very systematic rejection, as it were. But I think the residues remain. So even as a Marxist, he sort of talks about the Buddha as the highest achievement of human, you know, that a human can achieve. You know, he continues to have Shraddha, he says, despite not calling himself a Buddhist, and refusing to join Anand Kausalyan on that proselytizing on the London trip. You know, he is very he's doing his own thing. I mean, he's doing Buddhist scholarship. He carries the Thankas, etc., with him, meets Sylvain Levy and so on in Europe. He goes to France, but it's not necessarily, you know, a surrender of faith completely. So there is this kind of a distance that he maintains, and doesn't talk enough about the inner struggle. And then the first religion that he engages with is actually Shiv. As a very young man, he does a sadhana to make the Devi happy, and the Devi does not appear, and he takes an overdose of some drug, I forget, whatever they took, the Shivs, you know, and he nearly dies. He has to be resurrected. You know, so there is that also. After that, he becomes Vaishnav, and then he finds the Vaishnavs and the Shivs fighting with each other, and then he says, okay, I'm off to Arya Samaj.
Okay.
So there is
Sorry about that. I didn't mean to interrupt you. I thought you were done. Okay. All right. Thank you. We have gone over time between you and tea, so I dare not extend this any longer. I thank the audience, and I thank all the speakers, of course, for really quite a stimulating session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Wahid, and it really was a mind-expanding session, as Joyadi said. So now may we come to the Pashmina shawls will be presented.
Oh, right.
Please. Sudhaji.
Thank you. That was wonderful.
You did a very good. We actually had a discussion.
Well, yes, I was so happy when I saw
Yes,
it.
I saw. I was very happy when I saw that. They said that there was dancing.
Here you go with your Pashmina.
Oh,
thank you.
I don't know if I get one.
Anyways, and
I'm actually the stalker.
He actually pulled out,
Okay.
about 2 weeks ago. So then they said that they contacted
You mentioned shawls, I thought so.
Go ahead.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Gitanjali is coming first. Yes. Gitanjali is coming first. Yes. Nice answer. I hope you like this one, Gitanjali. Yes, I love it. Oh, lovely. Thank you. Thank you. What a fascinating paper it is. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's like.
May I request Dr. Alok Tripathi ji? Sorry, sir, आपका तो.
Yeah, I did.
थोड़ा अनौपचारिक रूप से.